Hello, and welcome back to the Common Connected podcast. I'm your host, Janine Halloran, and on today's episode, I dive into the topic of high sensitivity with my guest, Maureen. She is an author, an advocate regarding high sensitivity, and also is a parent who is navigating the waters of high sensitivity with her children. And she's a highly sensitive person herself. So we get a chance to do a deep dive into what that means. And we talk a little bit about some supports that she's created in her work. She runs the website, thehighlySensitiveChild.com. She has a Facebook group where she supports families who are raising children with high sensitivity. And she's also an author of the book, I Don't Like Birthday Parties. So I hope that you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Maureen, I'm so excited to have you on the Calm and Connected podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk with you today.
So I know that you have this interest and expertise in highly sensitive children, but I would love to hear a little bit more about you and your background so that you can share that with my audience so they know a little bit more about who you are and how you got here.
Sure. So I am a mom of two highly sensitive boys who are now 10 and 13. And back in 2013, my oldest son, Lucas, was diagnosed with a childhood anxiety disorder called selective mutism. And it was during this journey of trying to figure out what was going on with him that I was introduced to the term high sensitivity. And I learned about Dr. Aaron and her book, The Highly Sensitive Child. And so I read that and it changed everything. It changed like the whole course of our lives. It answered so many questions for us about, why my son was acting the way he was, like why he was overwhelmed by loud noises and crowds, how like sensory things bothered him, like the seams in his socks and just like finger painting, like he couldn't do that at school. And we're like, what is going on? And how he was so observant. Everyone was like, he is incredibly observant. Like he definitely took a long time to warm up, all that stuff. So I realized too, as I began learning more about high sensitivity, that I myself was also highly sensitive. And so was my husband and my mom. And I'm like, I had this eye-opening experience where I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the way I am. And I'm seeing that now in him. And I just never had like the words to really put to it. And I was like, more people need to know about this trait and we need to get this out there. So as we started going through the journey, I started a blog, just kind of like a personal blog. And then I began sharing more and more about high sensitivity, our experience with it. And this little blog eventually evolved into a parenting site to help other parents raising kids with high sensitivity. And it came into like, I started doing blogs and like blog posts, and I created some courses and some digital products. And I'm not a therapist. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a mom who has learned a lot along this journey in life. And so like I wouldn't say I'm like an expert in high sensitivity, but I've learned so much and I love sharing it with other parents, which has also led me to get some other great opportunities. I was able to fulfill a lifelong dream of becoming a traditionally published author with a book on high sensitivity. In 2021, I published a book called I Don't Like Birthday Parties. And it basically sheds light on the fact that it was about a little boy who doesn't really enjoy birthday parties because they're very overstimulating. And so it was a chance to kind of shed light on that, like not everyone likes birthday parties and how those things can be tough. And I've had so many like parents come up to me and they're like, wow, like I didn't like birthday parties as a kid. I wish, more people had, like this book was out when I was a kid. So just different things like that. And that has led over time, this is kind of like a long journey, but like over time, more and more people started asking me, okay, well, how can I share my message and like kind of reach out to other people? So then I started teaching blogging and digital products and things like that. And now I do web design full time and help other people start their platform to share their message. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
And here's the thing, I would say that you do have expertise in highly sensitive people, because not only are you raising them, you are one, and then you also have lived with one before when you were growing up. I think there's something to be said for like that in the trenches, like I know what it feels like, I understand. And
Right.
I had sort of the same sort of reaction to Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Child, that you did. I remember reading it and like highlighting particular portions, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is my child. And oh my gosh, this is me. Like it was one of those books. There's several books in my life that really changed the way that I think about like my work and my family and how I view people. And that was one for me that was really shocking. And I remember like when my son was very little, he could not stand birthday parties. He hated birthday parties. So the fact that she wrote a book, I would have totally read that to him and been like, listen, it is okay that you don't like it. And once I realized he didn't like it, I was like, we are changing the plan. We are not having birthday parties anymore, because I thought you would be okay with it, but you are really not.
Right. Yeah. And as a parent, sometimes you're just like, what's wrong with my kid? There's nothing like, but it's not, there's nothing wrong with them, but it's just, they just think differently. Like Dr. Aron says, about only 15 to 20% have it. And a lot of people don't understand it or know about it. So, yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So for people who don't understand and even understand what the term highly sensitive means, can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So Dr. Aron says this, but the highly sensitive person, they have a sensitive nervous system. And I know you talked about this in one of your podcasts, but she kind of uses the acronym DOES, which is DOES. And it breaks it down kind of in a nice way to really understand it. So that first is depth of processing for the day. And highly sensitive people, they tend to process things much more deeply. They process like sensory input, everything more deeply than others. And they kind of relate or compare it to past experiences and just kind of process everything. Like it takes time for them to warm up to things and stuff like that. They depend a lot on their intuition. That's kind of like the D in the depth of processing. The O is what most people notice, that's overstimulation. And that's kind of where with us, we're like, what is going on? Like he's having all these issues with like noise and everything bothers him. And that's that, the overstimulation. And I think that's very obvious in children who are still developing and learning how to manage their emotions and everything. They have less of a tolerance for like things that bother them, like the noises, the textures, the smells. For my kids, it was a lot of like playground, like being on a playground was really hard. So that's one of the things. And I noticed early on that like my child needed a lot more downtime than other kids. And that's because of all the overstimulation. And I think too, like as an adult or even any person, but there's some people who could go to amusement park all day and then come home, go to dinner, and then go out again. Where a highly sensitive person, that would be a very hard day for them. They need like one activity, then some downtime, and then, that's really important. So O is overstimulation. The E is emotion, like emotional, what's the word? Reactivity, I guess I would say, where they feel things really deeply, and that can be positive feelings they feel deeply, like they feel joy and happiness really deeply, which is a great thing. But then on the other hand, they can also experience like sadness intensely or like some negative emotions, which can be a challenging part of being highly sensitive. Again, I think children who are learning how to manage those big emotions, I think that's a challenge for parents raising highly sensitive kids. It's one of the biggest ones that I hear about, because like the anger sometimes, or like the sadness about something, it just explodes out of them. And it can be challenging for a parent to kind of know how to handle that. And then the S is sensing, like the subtle kind of, where they tend to notice a lot more in their environment. They tend to really take things in before they act. And that's just a part of the processing as well. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Again, about 15 to 20% have it. So it is a good amount, but it's also, in the grand scheme of things, like it's not, like, so many people still don't know about it.
Yeah, it is interesting because it isn't as talked about as I thought it would be, and or anticipated. You know what I mean? Like I really find her work so interesting because she's been doing all these studies and doing all this research and just seeing this pattern over and over again, and being able to understand what it is like for children, like the way that you described, like their happiness is really big. That's the way I describe it to families. Like their happy is really big, but their anger is also really big. So yes. It's like it's like it's the good with it's the good with the good with the bad. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like anger can be really big and really explosive, but happiness is so overwhelming and so joyful. It's incredible. Yeah. And it's tricky to tease out, right? Because like, how do you know if it's high sensitivity versus something else? And I know that there's a lot of sort of like misdiagnosis, not diagnosis, it's just more sort of like a personality, right? Right. But like, how could it be misinterpreted, I suppose, or labeled as something that wasn't necessarily highly sensitive, but could it be labeled as something else?
Yeah, so there's a lot, just from working with parents and me myself being a parent, it's easy to label it as something else. Like, first, it's not a flaw, because it's very easy to be like, this is a problem, this is a flaw, like, how do I fix it? And as parents raising a highly sensitive kid who feels things more deeply, has more emotional outbursts and stuff, it can be very overwhelming. And as a parent, you're like, I want to fix this, because they're going to, a lot of times they'll seem like the quote unquote perfect child out, like maybe in the classroom, but they're saving all that emotion for their parents when they come home, and they just like, let it out. And so it can be very challenging as a parent to know how to navigate that. But it's not a flaw. With love and patience, these children they're amazing children. It's not a weakness. I think a lot of times, especially I see them raising boys, and they're more highly sensitive kids who feel more like they would cry much more easily. And sometimes that can become they can become a target for bullying, as like they're weak. But I really feel like highly sensitive kids, they're incredibly strong kids. Like it takes a lot to be able to deal with all that. And they might not fit society's idea of like quote unquote strong, but I think that highly sensitive kids are like such amazing kids with so many different talents and gifts that I really see it as a strength. Another thing it's not, which I get a lot of, is it's not a diagnosis. It's not a disorder. Because a lot of people will say, well, how do I get this diagnosed? Or how do I, quote unquote, fix it? And it's not something that's going to be fixed. It's a biological trait that you have. It's like yours for life, whether you like it or not. It's not a condition. It's not a disorder, not a diagnosis. I find that just a supportive environment, once the parent is educated and knows how to work with a child with high sensitivity, they can really thrive. So as far as like what it's not, I would say that. And then like it can be easily misdiagnosed. With my son, when we were first going through a lot of stuff, like terms like autism came up, terms like sensory processing disorder came up, all these different things. And it didn't, like, I knew he wasn't autistic just from, different situations, but on the surface, it can look like that sometimes, especially with the sensory stuff, with the loud noises that sometimes, or the textures, all that stuff. So I think that's like something that you have to be aware of, and kind of just really, really know your kid and what their triggers are. Because ADHD is another thing where they may have trouble focusing in the classroom, which can be one of the things that goes hand in hand with ADHD. But if they're having fun, like they're okay at home doing homework where the environment's quiet and they can focus, it's likely not the same thing, so things like that. And the same thing with sensory processing disorder. With high sensitivity, it's situational, like with loud noises and stuff, it's a different situation than sensory processing disorder. So you just have to kind of know your facts and what triggers your kid and when.
Right. And I think that's what is tricky, because they do overlap so frequently. ADHD, anxiety, sensory processing. How do I know what is what? And I found it really helpful to actually use the checklist that she has, like the true false questions, to actually go through and say, oh, he like, this is what fits for him, and to like really notice how many of those statements were true. I think there's 17 or 19 on there, I think. I can't remember. And I think he has like, I like circled true for 13. And I was like, oh, well, that explains everything.
Yeah. Exactly. And sometimes they can have an overlap. Like my one highly sensitive kid, they both do have anxiety. My one does have ADHD. My other one does not. So it does depend on the child. They can overlap for sure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like, because they have sensory issues, they have sensory processing disorder and something like that. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And it is really tricky. And I love that you're like, it's not a diagnosis. And I just want to emphasize that for people. Mm-hmm. Like I don't think of it as a diagnosis. I think of it as just like part of a personality. Like that's just part of who you are, like introverted or extroverted. You are highly sensitive or not,
Right.
And I find it to just be a helpful piece of information for me to keep in mind when my son is going through new situations. Like I'm thoughtful about how I introduce things. And you just have to think a little bit differently about how you work with them, how you approach them about certain things. And when you keep that in mind, they can flourish and thrive, and it makes it so much easier. And then I realized for myself, like I set my life up in a way that like helps me just to like dig into me being highly sensitive. Like I got it,
Right. Yeah.
I found a job that works for me. I found a way of like, I found clothes that work for me. I found socks that work for me. I find, what I mean? Like you find all these different things that work for you. Like my rhythm of my day, my rhythm of like seeing people versus downtime, and the way that I set it up for my kids, actually, it helps me. So I sort of set it up for myself. So then I set it up for my kid too.
Yeah, it's a process. And I think as parents, because as an adult, we're aware of those things. So like, okay, I need to do these things for myself. But as a child, you're still processing and learning. And so I think our role as parents, if you have a highly sensitive kid, is to start helping them kind of embrace their high sensitivity. And it's a process. Even as a parent, you're going to make missteps with it for sure, because it's a learning journey, but you'll start seeing what works and what doesn't, and just preparing for different events and ways you can just kind of prepare them for what to expect in certain situations, I think really helps you and them and you.
Oh, I love that. So I love that idea of like being just letting families know, like you can be planful, like you can make a plan for going into a certain situation, for going into like a new school year, going into, you're going on a vacation to an amusement park. Like Disney World can be overwhelming. So what's your plan? And it doesn't have to look like everybody else's plan either. Like, don't feel like you have to do all the things. Like you could take an afternoon and go back to the hotel and swim by the pool, or go to that hotel and shut all the lights off for a little bit and then go back out. Like that's allowed. And I think giving families that permission to be like, this isn't going to work for my family, and so I'm going to do something different.
Exactly. And I think it's hard. Sometimes it can be hard because our society is so not that way. They're like, go, go, go. It's okay to remember that, yes, it's okay to do things differently, what works for your family. And it's not going to look probably the way that you think everyone's doing it, but that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. I know that you've worked with a lot of families who are dealing with highly sensitive kids. Is there any other advice or recommendations you would give to them if they're, thinking that their child might be highly sensitive? What would you recommend, or any advice you would give them?
Yeah, so the first, we kind of talked about the self-test that Dr. Erin has, but I do usually send people there first. Her website is hsperson.com, and then I think it's just a /test, maybe /test. And there's a couple self-tests on there. There's one just for like you as an adult to take as a highly sensitive person, and then there's one, I think it's called like, is my child highly sensitive? And she says on there, like, it's not a, hard, like this is exactly what you have, but as you go through it, there's different statements that she has written down, and you can click yes, this is true, or this is not true, like my child has trouble with this. And it takes you through a bunch of statements, and at the end you add them up, and she says okay, yes or no, about your child might be highly sensitive. So I would say that could be like a first step. And then I would definitely recommend reading The Highly Sensitive Child, because to me, Dr. Aaron's like, she's the pioneer of high sensitivity. And I think if you read that book, you're going to learn a lot, and you're either going to be like, yes, this is my child. Like you said, with you and me too, it's like, oh my gosh, this is what we're working with here. I would say those are the two places that I would absolutely start. And then from there, it's just about learning how to work with your child and come up with a plan that works for you and your family for, working with that personality type.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that I really love in Dr. Aaron's book is she goes through and she sort of highlights every age range and talks about how you as a parent with high sensitivity can interact versus you as a parent that doesn't have high sensitivity can interact with the child in ways that are beneficial, because there is something really helpful. And like, because not everybody is highly sensitive, obviously. If it's only 15 to 20% of the population, everybody else isn't. And so there's a chance like that you may have had a child with somebody who does not have high sensitivity, and then you've got
Absolutely.
so that had, or like two parents that are not highly sensitive raising a highly sensitive child. And so how do you use your strengths and play to their strengths? And I love that piece of the book. It's not like no, it's not good or it's bad, or like, it's not a judgment statement. It's just like, this is going to be helpful, and this is an area of strength for you, this is an area of strength for your child. How can we work together to build a child who's going to be able to be in the world?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I forgot that was in the book. Like, if you're not highly sensitive, because a lot of times parents, one of the things is like our mom or a dad will come and be like, my significant other is not highly sensitive, and they don't think it's a thing, or they're really frustrated because they can't understand where their child's coming from. So I think that's a huge part of that book is, well, how can I understand this if I'm not highly sensitive? So yeah, definitely.
It's really, really helpful. And it's just an interesting read just to understand like how other people are in the world. And she has like other books, doesn't she? She has like The Highly Sensitive Person, The Highly Sensitive Person in Love. So if this is something that you really resonate with as a person, then you can go and do a deeper dive for yourself, to
Absolutely.
really understand like how you interact in relationships, how you interact, like just how you are as a person and what's going to be most beneficial and helpful to you. And then you also have the website, The Highly Sensitive Child. So there's some resources on there for families as well, right?
Yes, lots of different articles, a course related to school, because the school is a big issue, some digital products related to big emotions, things like that. But yes, all those resources are at thehighlysensitivechild.com.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And I want to be respectful of your time, but I always ask my guests one last question. What are your coping skills? How do you like to rest and relax?
So as a highly sensitive person myself, I need a lot of downtime. So I have to be very intentional about scheduling in that downtime. As a busy parent, and my downtime, I love to get out in nature. That's huge for me. I love taking walks. That's my release. I try to get one in once a day if I can, hike when I can. I've been trying to intentionally at night, like for the last hour that I'm up. Doesn't happen every day, but I try to unplug for like that last hour. No electronics, no nothing, because that can be overstimulating to me, and just try to like do a book or journal or something like that. And I find when I do make the time for that, it really does. I sleep better. I just feel like it's a better routine for me. And then in the morning, and I have to say, this is what I'm still working on, but I'm trying to carve out that time, even just 15 minutes before the kids get up, just for me, so I'm not catapulted into the day. But for some reason, I just cannot get out of bed in the morning. I'm working on it, but that is something that I'm trying to be more intentional about too, because when I do it makes such a difference in the day.
You know what, Maureen, it is hard to get up in the morning. My kids get up at like 6 a.m. There's no way I'm getting up 15 minutes before they do.
I know, right?
There's no way.
And it's getting colder here, and it's getting darker, and it's a little harder to get up now. So
yes, exactly. It's hard to get up in the dark, and then to try and find and carve that time. I end up carving the time in after they get on the bus. So they both get on the bus, and then I have this like window of time that I actually have started to make space for. Like, that's when I do maybe an exercise, or that's maybe when I have some just quiet time. Like, I'm sipping my coffee, I'm listening to music, or I'm listening to a book, going on a walk, those sorts of things before I actually start my day. Because it's really easy as somebody who works from home to be like, to like bop into my office after they're gone, right? But then I'm like, but wait, I can set my own schedule. So I do like, I put a pause on it, and I'm like, I'm doing the things for me, and then I'll dive right in when it's work time. So
yeah, no, that's a great way to do it for sure. Yeah.
So I'm going to encourage you. You can do it. You can find space. You'll find it. It's just hard. It's like the morning routines are challenging when you have little ones, or just like mine aren't even that little, but it's still challenging.
Yeah, it is. I think sometimes as they get older, it's even harder, because you're like, get going, come on.
Yes, every morning I'm like, the bus is coming, get on the bus.
I hear you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the Calm and Connected podcast. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Yes, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
And I hope our listeners have as well. And if you like this podcast, please feel free to take a moment and share it with your friends and colleagues. And as always, don't forget about yourself. Take a few minutes, have a little fun, and have an awesome day.